Welcome back. I finished render mapping my entire scene here with Beast. It took about a couple of hours. I went ahead and tweaked and changed some of the settings after doing some more test renders off camera. I'm really picky about lighting and the way stuff looks, so I went back and made some tweaks and changes and rendered again. And here's my render settings. I added an extra bounce, so I went with 2 bounces instead of 1. And I decided to give my scene a little bit of bounce boost, so I increased it from 1 to 1.5. And that was just to increase the indirect illumination a little bit. And I also went to my sunlight. And if I come over here to the object view in the light mapping window, you can see that I increased my bounce intensity for the sunlight to a value of 2, so it's twice as strong with the bounce intensity, not the regular intensity, just the indirect illumination intensity. If I come inside my scene, you can see what I have. Looks pretty good. We've got the ambient occlusion. We've got the nice indirect illumination bouncing around everywhere. Looks pretty nice. So I'm pretty happy with this. And again, the final render took about a couple of hours to do. So we're finished with the light mapping portion here. What I'm going to do next is just some simple tweaks here before I move on to the next subject. For example, this object here, if you remember, I took the alpha cutoff from some of these transparent shaders. And I cranked it all the way up, so I'll knock it back down to about the middle just to fix this stuff up. So take a moment to do that with your materials here. Just knock this alpha cutoff back down. Alright, so everything's looking pretty good. Now what I want to do is I want to talk about environment effects. Okay, environment effects, if you remember, if we go up here to our viewport, we have this little button that turns environment effects on and off. Alright. Environment effects are things like lens flares, things like the ambient light in our scene, fog in our scene, things like the skybox and stuff like that. So that's what I'm going to cover in this video right here. So let's start off with ambient light. If I come over here to the edit menu and go down to my render settings, these are the render settings over here in the inspector of this current scene. So I have different types of environment effects that I can adjust here. Some of the most important ones are things like fog, the ambient lighting, and the skybox material. Those are probably the most important ones you have to adjust. Now I covered a little bit of ambient lighting before. Okay, if I go to ambient lighting and I try to change it now, you're not going to notice any difference in the scene. The reason that the ambient lighting is not working right now is because I'm using light mapping. When you use light maps, Unity automatically turns off ambient lighting for those specific objects. So any objects that have light mapping, which is pretty much my entire scene right now, will not have any ambient lighting affected. Objects that don't have light maps will be affected by this ambient light. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that ambient light back down to pretty much 0 by setting it to black. So let me talk about skybox. Skybox is pretty important. If I look right now at the sky in my scene here, my virtual scene, it's just gray. There's nothing there. Obviously that doesn't look right. What we need is a very nice picture, maybe some kind of panorama in the background showing some kind of a scene here to give us a better sense of our ambient environment here through the sky. So how do we set up a skybox? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Over here we have this parameter for skybox material. By default it's set to none. So we have to apply skybox material. Okay. Now there's 2 ways you can go about using the skybox material. You can go with method A, which is to use the ones that come with Unity. And if I come over to my standard assets folder, okay, some of the standard assets that you can import into a new project in Unity, as you saw when I started this tutorial, was skyboxes. So Unity actually comes with a whole bunch of skyboxes that you can use. So we have this Dawn Dusk skybox, and you can see a little sample right here. We've got this Eerie skybox, Moonshine, Overcast 1 and 2, and so on and so forth. So you can use one of these, okay? Or you can create your own custom skybox in some kind of 2D image editing program such as Photoshop and just create your own custom ones from scratch. Alright? What I did, or what I'm going to do for this scene here, is kind of a hybrid approach. A little bit of both. A little bit of both method A and a little bit of both method B. I'll show you what I mean here. Again, I'll go to those render settings that I was at before. So here's the skybox material. There's nothing there now. So what I can do is I can go to the skyboxes folder here in the standard assets, and I can click and drag one of these skybox materials onto the skybox material slot. So for example, let me say I want to use the Dawn Dusk skybox. I'll drop it on there, and now you can see I have this really cool sunset kind of skybox in my scene, which obviously makes the scene look more realistic. There's a problem, however. The default one that comes with Unity has the sun in the wrong position. My sun is located over here and it's shining from this area, but if I look over to the left, my sun is actually over there. So the skybox is not going to match up with the lighting in the scene. There's a couple of things we can do. You can either redo all of the lighting in your scene to match up with the skybox, which is not very practical, or you can try to make the skybox match up to the scene's lighting, which is the best way to go about it. That's actually what you want to do. So there's no easy way to just take the skybox and rotate it. Unfortunately, you can't just grab the whole thing and rotate it a little bit to the right and make the sun match up. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the some of the skybox textures that come with Unity, and all I did was I went into a 2D image editing program and adjusted them and changed them around a little bit so that the sun would be located in this general area over here as opposed to being way over there in the wrong spot. So let me go ahead and create a skybox material from scratch. So let me go to the warehouse here. I'm going to right click on the warehouse folder. I'm going to go to create and I'm going to go to material. So I'm creating a brand new material. I'm going to rename this material before I do anything else. I'm going to call it skybox, or actually let me just call it so it makes more sense. I'll call it warehouse sky, so I know that's the warehouse sky material. By default, it's just a diffuse shader, so let's go to the shader drop-down list and let's change it to a skybox material, something we can use. Go to the render effects and select skybox, not skybox cube, but skybox. Okay. Basically, we have 6 different map slots where we can apply images. So the way this works is you need 6 images. An image that represents the front, the back, left, right, up, and down, or top and bottom. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I already have some textures ready to go and set up for this. So I'm going to go over here to the textures folder, and if I go down, I'll find these sky textures right here. So sky back, sky down, front, left, right, and up. Okay, and I'm going to plug these into the correct slots on my material. So let me go back to the material here, open it up, and I'm going to come back up here and start to just drag and drop and connect these textures to the slots. So for the front, I'll place the front. For the back, I'll place the back. And you'll notice that nothing updates in the scene. That's because we still have that other material in the scene. So let me go back to the edit, render settings. I'm going to come over here to this slot and I'm going to select none. Okay. Then I'm going to go down here in my project view. And I'm going to grab the warehouse sky material, drag and drop it right into the skybox material slot. So here it is. The white areas are areas that haven't had the correct texture plugged in yet. Okay. So let me go over to the sky material here, and I'm going to continue plugging in textures. So I'll plug in the left texture. I'll plug in the right. And you can see as I start to plug these in, they update in the viewport in real time. If you don't see them, it's probably because you have the effects button turned off in the viewport, so make sure that's on. And then I'll just plug in the up and the down. Okay. And now if I come up here and I look around in my scene, you can see that I have skybox material that wraps my entire scene. Now you'll probably notice that there's a problem. The problem is I have these really strange texture seams in the corners, so it looks like we're inside a giant children's playroom that has the walls painted like a sky or something weird like that. So what you need to do is you need to change a very important setting for the textures. So I'm going to go to each one of these textures one by one. And I'm going to change the setting. When you're dealing with skybox textures, you have to go to the texture import settings for that specific texture. In this case, all 6. And you have to change the wrap mode up here from repeat, which is the default, to clamp. Okay? So do that for all of them and doesn't sell the effect. So once I switch all of them to clamp mode for the wrap mode, you notice that those seams magically disappear. Now we have ourselves a really nice skybox that wraps our scene nicely. So the sun in this skybox is actually coming from the direction of the sky that matches up with the lighting much better than before. Okay, so that pretty much does it for skybox. Just a quick thing to note here: the skybox textures have alpha channels. Okay, alpha channels will help with certain special effects later, and we'll see that later when we get into post-processing effects. But we won't talk about that right now. Okay, so now that the skybox is done, one last thing you might want to put on your scene to give it a final touch and make the environment look a little bit more convincing is fog. In real life, if you were to go to the top of a mountain and just stare into the distance, you'd probably be able to see for miles on a clear, sunny, bright day. However, there's a certain limit where you start to see a sort of environment fog where you can't see forever, okay? This fog effect can be imitated inside of Unity using the fog effect. So let's go back to the edit menu, go to render settings where we had our skybox material and stuff like that, and we have this fog parameter. Let's turn it on. By default it's turned off, and when we turn it on we get this fog, okay? The closer we get to objects, the more clear they become. The farther objects are away from the camera, the more densely covered they become in fog, alright? So right now the fog doesn't look too great, it looks kind of weird. So the way to make this look good is to pick a color of the fog that looks good in your scene. In this case, this neutral sort of gray color doesn't look very good. So you can choose something like, say, a bluish type of color. Something like that looks good on a sunny day. In this case, we have sort of a sunset, so I'm going to go with more of a warm yellowish tone. So something more like this, and not too saturated. Desaturate a little bit, so something like this looks pretty decent. So just choose a color that looks good for your scene. Now you notice that the buildings in the background are completely obscured by the fog, which doesn't look good. We can control this using the fog density. So over here we have this parameter called fog density. By default it's 0.01. Each scene will need a different fog density. So for this specific scene, 0.01 is actually a little bit too much. So I'm going to try something like maybe 0.0005, and that actually looks pretty good. So now I can still see the buildings in the background, but they are obscured a little bit by fog. And as I come into my scene here inside the warehouse, and I look from end to end, I can see this really cool fog effect. So if I turn the fog off, this is before, fog on, this is after. Now if the fog's a little bit too bright, which in this scene I think it's a little bit too bright, and it gets rid of those dark areas which I don't like, I can come to the fog color and maybe lower the value a little bit to darken it up. So just play around with the settings till you get something that you like. And obviously a warehouse like this would look a little bit misty and foggy inside. There's dust and particles in the air, and this helps to sell that effect. So the key here, at least in my opinion, is to go with something that's very subtle, not something strong. So just a subtle amount can sell the effect much better than if you go overboard and crank those values all the way up and then it looks kind of weird. Okay, so that looks pretty good. So that's going to do it for the environment effects here in Unity, some of the basic environment effects you can use to improve our scene, make it look much more convincing.